have Mr. Harrell. His mentor, Dr. Reed, is not here today, but that is all right. So he's going to be reading a paper for us. Please take it away, Charles.
Right. Hi, everyone. So last fall, I wrote a literary analysis on a poet by the name of Natalie Diaz for my Intro to English Studies class with Dr. Reed. If you guys are not familiar with Diaz's work, she was born in the Fort Mojave Indian Village in Needles, California. She is a Mojave Indian and an enrolled member of the Geo River Indian community. She earned a bachelor's from Old Dominion University, where she received a full athletic scholarship and even played professional basketball. She is the author of many poetry collections, including post-colonial love poems, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, When My Brother Was an Aztec, which a New York Times reviewer, Eric McHenry, described as an ambitious, beautiful book. Her honors and awards include the Nimrod Hardman Pablo Neretta Prize for Poetry, the Louis Untermeyer Scholarship for Poetry in Breadloaf, and the Narrative Poetry Prize and a Lannan Literary Fellowship. During our study of her for Dr. Reed's class, I paid special attention to a poem by the title, Abecedarian Requiring Further Examination of Anglikan Seraphym Subjugation of a Wild Indian Reservation. Kind of a mouthful, but it illustrates the long-established history of tension and brutality between Native Americans and Europeans. The speaker forms a glaring criticism of imperialism and religious re-education by portraying Christian imagery. The poem also contains a deliberate balance of irony and earnestness with abecedarian form and some heavy subject matter. And these devices in combination develop a declaratory tone, as it seems the speaker is boldly reclaiming their identity as Native American, despite the external forces of white supremacy and the continual erasure of their culture. So I'm going to briefly read it aloud for you guys. Angels don't come to the reservation. Bats, maybe, or owls, boxy mottled things. Coyotes, too. They all mean the same thing. Death. And death eats angels, I guess, because I haven't seen an angel fly through this valley ever. Gabriel? Never heard of him. Know a guy named Gabe, though. He came through here one powwow and stayed, typical Indian. Sure he had wings, jailbird that he was. He flies around in stolen cars. Wherever he stops, kids grow like gourds from women's bellies. Like I said, no Indian I've ever heard of has ever been or seen an angel. Maybe in a Christmas pageant or something. Nazarene Church holds one every December, organized by Pastor John's wife. It's no wonder Pastor John's son is the angel. Everyone knows angels are white. Quit bothering with angels, I say. They're no good for Indians. Remember what happened last time when some white god came floating across the ocean? Truth is, there may be angels, but if there are angels up there, living on clouds or sitting on thrones across the sea, wearing velvet robes and golden rings, drinking whiskey from silver cups, we're better off if they stay rich and fat and ugly, exactly where they are, in their own distant heavens. You better hope you never see angels on the res. If you do, they'll be marching you off to Zion or Oklahoma, or some other hell they've mapped out for us. So throughout this poem, the speaker maintains an almost aloof description of their destitute resolution as a result of conquest. The first few lines of the poem somberly affirm the conditions, and even though these lines serve to illustrate the harsher aspects of life on the reservation, the speaker's use of Native American animal symbols seems to focus attention to their identity as Native American. While the reservation is not a place the speaker deems necessarily inviting or analogous to something beautiful, it is a place that is undoubtedly tied to the customs of indigenous society and culture. The following lines further develop the speaker's way of commenting their cultural identity, the reference to Gabriel. This excerpt is subtly more brash in its delivery, as it addresses Christian figures with a sort of underhanded irreverence. The speaker diminishes the importance of the biblical figure of Gabriel and instead describes a Native American vagabond with a similar name, Gabe, who took residence at her reservation. She describes him as a criminal who steals cars and is generally reckless, And by dismissing any notion of Archangel Gabriel and instead delving into a description of Gabe, the speaker emphasizes the importance of the reservation's people over that of the religion forced upon them. And so, while speaking of the Christmas pageant a local church puts on, the speaker says, "It's no wonder Pastor John's son is the angel. Everyone knows angels are white." This is the most abrupt connection the speaker makes between Christianity and white supremacy, and how these two forces were weaponized simultaneously to disempower indigenous groups. So Diaz's poetry is a diligent rejection of white supremacy and servitude to imperious power. She discusses this aspect of her work with the University of Oklahoma scholar David Shook in a published interview titled "Poetry as Wonder, Desire, Rage, and Memory," a conversation with Natalie Diaz. In this interview, she explains her and her family's early relationship with language and poetry, saying, "We live on our Mojave homelands and see the land stories all around us. We don't name things after the white men who discovered our land. We name things for what has happened there, the ways we interacted with the land in that place." And so from an early age, we see that Diaz developed concepts of language and storytelling within the cultural influences of her reservation, which ultimately shaped the content of her poetry. She further explains her relationship with literary expression and how she balances the cultural and artistic tension between the Mojave and English languages. She says, "I think my relationship to Mojave, my experience with those absence and loss, have led me to be more careful with English. And by careful, I mean tender and also wary. I know what English thinks of me. I know its limits in thinking of me." These statements, I think, indicate Diaz's general opinion of the English language and possibly its whole literary tradition, as it presents itself as, or that it's inferior in sort of encapsulating the Mojave language. And having experienced it herself, she is aware of the social and cultural tension between indigenous people and other Americans, and this influences her general feelings of alienation from English. She does assert, however, her belief that Mojave is a linguistic tradition so adept in its representation of its people that English cannot effectively do the same. This belief is evident in the poem, as her stylistic choices serve to empower the cultural identity of the Mojave speaker. The stylistic forms she implements in the poem are highly effective in affirming Native American cultural identity with elements of humor and irony. Even the title is a deliberate misspelling of Anglikan, that's Anglikan, and this stylistic choice seems to mock the conventions of proper English spelling and does this specifically to a word that describes a sect of Christianity. It's worth noting, too, the significance of the abecedarian form of poetry in religious works throughout history, namely the literature of the Middle East within Abrahamic religions. For example, Claudia Lorini, an Aramaic scholar, in her article, "The Title Tabernacle in M28/I, an Anti-Judeo-Christian Ptolemaic Strophe," she provides information about a previously elusive Middle Persian hymn, which scholars found was an evidently polemic text alluding to passages Exodus 25 and 26, where the tabernacle and the temple is described. The strophe, by virtue of being a polemic text, serves to criticize early Judeo-Christian religion, much like Diaz's poem. It is more likely, however, that Diaz utilized the abecedarian form because of its prevalence in biblical psalms. And by employing the style so popular in Christian liturgy, in a poem that figuratively criticizes Christianity in the context of colonialism, her poem reclaims the cultural and spiritual identity of the Mojave with a subtle irony. And to further establish a sense of her own indigenous identity in the poem, Diaz alludes to specific historical events that involve the conquest of Native American land and the dissolution of their culture. The speaker makes a direct reference to religious motivations of Europeans, saying, "Quit bothering with angels, I say, they're no good for Indians. Remember what happened last time some white god came floating across the ocean." While these lines are an obvious critique of the religious oppression enacted by colonial settlers, the speaker is also expressing a broad discontent with the presence of their descendants, asserting that they are no good for the sovereignty and well-being of Native American society. Christina Ackley examines this idea in her article titled Laura Cornelius Kellogg, Lolomi and Modern Oneida Placemaking, where she recounts the work of renowned author and activist Laura Kellogg, founder of the Society of American Indians. Ackley explains Kellogg's motivation for developing self-sufficient reservations, that lack of economic opportunities fueled social dysfunction on the reservation. Reservations could be vibrant places if they only had the economic base. Here, Ackley reiterates Kellogg's criticism of the United States government's long history of underfunding and generally neglecting reservations, while simultaneously prohibiting them from being self-reliant states. This idea is reflected in Diaz's poem, as the speaker repeatedly associates American presence with the impoverished state of the reservation. The poem does not just implicate the government's material and financial abuse on reservations, but it's also more conclusive efforts to eradicate Native American identity as a whole. Native American writer Megan I. Pizer addresses this in an essay titled We Have Always Been Here, where she says, "There is nothing like a government defining your race for you and deciding for you that you are not enough of your identity to own or feel it. Americans are continually fed the myth of the disappearing Indian." Here, Pizer expresses a testament of the loss of identity indigenous people face in America, but also stresses the myth that Native American culture is non-existent and therefore unimportant in the present day. And in the same way, Diaz's poem the speaker affirms their identity despite the historically oppressive tactics implied by the United States government. So in conclusion, Abecedarian requiring further examination of Anglikan Seraphym subjugation of a wild Indian reservation combines a unique use of style and historical and cultural reference to express resistance to the continual erasure of Native American culture and identity. Diaz achieves this through a balance of irony and intensity in tone and allusions to European conquest and brutality against indigenous people. These features develops the poem's overall effect of reclaiming one's identity amid prejudice, neglect, and non-representation on a societal scale. Any questions?
Other questions? What do you think of the irony of having to express your frustrations in the other group's language?
That is definitely what I found most striking about that interview with Diaz, is that she, simultaneously, is ill-filled toward the English language, but then uses it so beautifully to convey her own struggles with living in between these two cultures. So I just found that very impactful.
So when you were reading the poem to us, Charles, there was reference to a bat. Is that right? In the beginning? When you were working on this, did you research that at all? Like that choice, why it was a bat rather than something else? I'm just curious because I don't know a lot about Native American.
No, I did just I knew that those opening references to animals hold some breadth of value for Native American culture, but I didn't look that deep into it. But it'd be interesting.
Any other questions for our speaker? All right, let's thank you again.